Welcome to the Checotah Public Library. I'm Beth Sherrill, the library assistant here, and we have during the month of February an exhibit on Tulsa and the 1921 massacre riots, the events that happened that year. And we will have it here for the whole month, and we encourage you to come look and read it and see what's on there. And I think you will probably learn some things that perhaps you did not know. I certainly did. Having not grown up in Oklahoma, I was not familiar with any of this event until a few years ago. This morning we are very pleased to have with us Jimmie White. He is a student of history, having earned his master's in history at OSU. He has recently retired from teaching history at Connors State College and is a member of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, can't say that well today, and is coming today to just discuss the events, walk you through the exhibit, and I am looking forward to what he has to say today. And so we want to welcome him, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the library giving me this opportunity to talk to you about a pivotal event in Oklahoma history. I always begin my history courses with this Native American saying, "A people without history is like wind upon the buffalo grass." And so in Scripture, it talks about you don't know where the wind comes from, therefore you don't know where it goes. And so there are people who are the same as wind because we don't know where they're coming from and we don't know where they've gone. And so black people had their humanity lost for a long period of time on purpose in the United States. And so I want to talk about the beginning, and that is we can start with Jamestown, 1619. Jamestown, Virginia, a storm brought in a slave trading ship, and a deal was made to sell 24 stolen Africans to the planters in Jamestown. And from this point, the process began to strip these human beings of all of their history up to the point of what we're going to discuss today, and that's the 1921 Tulsa race riot. And so America's slavery experience began, as I said, in Jamestown, Virginia. And as the nation grew and expanded, so did the institution of slavery. As John Hope Franklin from Rennesville near Checotah stated, the peculiar institution of slavery. And so American slavery was not the first, but it was a strange new form of slavery. And so slavery in America spread from Virginia westward and southward, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and as far west as past Mississippi into what is now Indian Territory or Oklahoma. And so in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson began a policy of what they referred to as Indian removal. Some of the best cotton growing land, and slavery was based on a labor-intensive cash crop, tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo, and then eventually cotton. And so some of the best cotton growing land in the United States was owned and controlled by Native Americans in several southeastern states: Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, in these regions. And so what were known as the so-called 5 civilized tribes occupied these areas: the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee. These 5 tribes were slave owners, and the American slave owners needed that land. And so Andrew Jackson instituted a policy of removing the tribes from their land and moving them west of the Mississippi River into Arkansas and then eventually into what was known as Indian Territory. So this began the process known as the Trail of Tears. But what most people forget or purposely ignore is the fact that these are slave-owning tribes, and not only did they bring their goods with them, but they brought their slaves. And so this is the beginning of what we refer to as the slave experience in Indian Territory. We'll move now to the first panel. This first panel is dealing with the early history of what is now known as Tulsa. And so Tulsa Town, as it was known, slowly grew in Indian Territory. And so, as I mentioned before, there were 5 civilized tribes. The territory was divided up between these tribes, and one of the prominent tribes was the Creek Nation, or better known as the Muskogee or Muskogee Nation. And so Tulsa Town was a gathering place, a stomp ground for Creeks in this northeastern part of what is now Oklahoma. And so Tulsa Town slowly grew until the turn of the century when oil is discovered. But prior to this, as I said, these 5 tribes were slave owners. And so from 1619, when 24 African slaves were sold in Jamestown, by the 1860s, there were over 4 million slaves in the United States. By this point, some people were enlightened and began to understand that slavery was an immense evil that needed to be eradicated. And so in 1861, we see the beginning of the end of chattel slavery in the United States, with the first shots being fired at Fort Sumter. And so the Civil War began. Now, during the Civil War, we see in Indian Territory, a slave-holding territory, the only one in the Confederacy, a struggle to maintain slavery and to put an end to it. And so the tribes are divided. We see former slaves run away and join the Union forces to put an end to slavery. And so one of the most famous of those Union forces was the precursor to what is known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The 9th and 10th Cavalry were the Buffalo Soldiers. And so the first black regiment to see action during the Civil War was the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. And so the most decisive battle fought to put an end to slavery in Indian Territory occurred July 17, 1863, near Checotah, and that was the Battle of Honey Springs, where the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was able to defeat with other Union forces, to defeat the Confederates. And so Indian Territory was then put in control of the federal government. Following the Civil War, we see people who still wanted to maintain slavery. And so the nation is divided, and so we have a political division between the Democrats, who were primarily slave owners, and Republicans, who were abolitionists. And so in 1865, in Tennessee, we see a organization, the most infamous of these organizations, to maintain the old ways of the slave South. The Ku Klux Klan was formed, and so Reconstruction and the resistance to Reconstruction is going to roil the nation for quite some time. Now, because slavery has been ended, the Emancipation Proclamation has been declared, we're going to see a phenomenon known as the exodusters. And so-called freedmen, former slaves, were promised 40 acres and a mule. However, the federal government is not going to follow through with that promise. And so we see these black farmers moving west with others in the nation to acquire land to become independent farmers. And so in Indian Territory, as I said, Tulsa town, these tribes were slave owners. And in the Muskogee or Muskogee Nation, one of the things that the slave owners did quite often was to allow their slaves to live in separate communities. And so we're going to see all black towns formed in Indian Territory. And so some of the earliest were like Redbird, Tallahassee, Taft. And so Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, has more all-black towns than any other state in the United States. And so eventually over 50 all-black towns are going to be eventually formed in Indian Territory. But these freedmen are attracting other freedmen to Indian Territory at this time. And so these towns are growing. Freedmen are coming into Indian Territory and realizing that this is a good place to settle and raise their families. And so one of the most famous of the exodusters, or boomers, was Edward P. Mccabe from Kansas. And so eventually, so many Americans had moved into Indian Territory that they began demanding that Indian Territory be given statehood. And so these men wanted Oklahoma Territory to become a state. And so E.P. Mccabe and others are promoting the opening of Indian Territory to all American settlement. Prior to this, only the tribes or their former slaves legally could live in Indian Territory. And so April 22nd, 1889, Indian Territory was opened up through a process known as the land run. And overnight, Stillwater, Langston, Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Edmond, all of these various towns were just prairies in the morning when the sun came up, and by the time the sun went down, we have growing communities. And so McCabe hoped that he could turn Oklahoma Territory into freedmen territory. And so he called for over 40,000 blacks to make the land run, but his numbers were quite short of that. Only about 10,000 came, and McCabe's dream of becoming the governor of an all-black state were dashed. However, the black population of Indian Territory is going to continue to grow. And so finally in 1907, the population of Oklahoma was sufficient to warrant a new state. And so 1907, the 46th state in the Union is admitted. Now the problem was that in Indian Territory, eastern part of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma Territory, the western part, they were forced together into one state by a Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt famously said that it's bad enough that one Democrat state would come into the Union while he was president. He certainly would not allow two. And so the scheme was to bring in the state of Sequoia and the state of Oklahoma. And so he forces them to join together into one state. However, Southerners, along with the tribes, are now forced together into one state, and the very first law that the Oklahoma State Legislature passed was a law to segregate solely on the basis of race. And so we'll move to the next panel. 1907, the state of Oklahoma is formed, and we see segregationist forces controlling the state legislature, but all across the United States. Segregation, lynching, they're being fought by organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that was formed in 1909. And so these organizations are determined to fight Jim Crow, as segregation was referred to, and the Ku Klux Klan. Now, in Oklahoma, the Klan was quite popular. However, in Oklahoma, the Klan was not as repugnant to the citizens of Oklahoma as it was in the deeper southern states. And so we see prominent politicians, businessmen, people of high stature in society actively being members of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, segregation is going to continue in the state of Oklahoma, and we see in Tulsa, as I said, which is by the turn of the century going to explode because of the discovery of oil in places like Glenpool, Drumright, and surrounding areas. And so Tulsa is segregated. And so the city of Tulsa, we're going to see blacks moving into the city of Tulsa to take advantage of the opportunities there that they could not find on the farms in the all-black towns surrounding these cities like Oklahoma City or Tulsa. And so conditions continue to prosper in Oklahoma Territory. Now, on the world scene, the United States is one of the most prosperous nations on earth, and so they began to rival the Europeans. And we see situations in Europe that are going to erupt, that are going to affect Oklahoma. And so in 1914, the Great War, as it's referred to, but now known as the First World War, the Great War erupts, and Oklahomans of all races are going to go to Europe to make the world safe for democracy. And so we see Tulsans, black Tulsans, going to fight in Europe, but they're not fighting just for democracy and freedom for the Europeans, but to show that freedom and democracy should be given to blacks living in America. And so they're fighting for first-class citizenship. And so democracy is determined to be gained by these veterans of the First World War. Following the First World War experience in America, we're going to see a backlash. And so returning American veterans find that now they have black people who are competing with them for jobs and housing. And so throughout the summer of 1919, we're going to see race riot after race riot occur. And so this is known as the Red Summer of 1919. Now, lynching is a tool that the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations use to try to force blacks to remain subservient to them. And so Oklahoma was not immune from this phenomenon of lynching. And one of the most infamous cases of lynching occurred not far from here in Okemah, when Laura Nelson and her son were hung from a bridge in Okemah. And so we'll move to the next panel. Following the First World War, the war and the post-war conditions hit the United States like an earthquake. And as I was mentioning before, we see race riot after race riot occur. And so it's referred to as the Red Summer of 1919. Now, in Indian Territory and now the state of Oklahoma, blacks prospered. And so one of the reasons that black people moved to Oklahoma was because they had opportunities here that they could not get in the Deep South. Oil is making the city of Tulsa. In fact, Tulsa used to be known as the oil capital of the world. And so blacks came in from all over to take the advantage of these opportunities. So by 1921, there were over 11,000 black people living in segregated Greenwood. As I said, the very first law passed by the Oklahoma State Legislature was a law to segregate solely on the basis of race. And they segregated from the time that you were born in a segregated hospital, to the time that you died, you were buried in a segregated cemetery. And everything else that you did between birth and death, it was all segregated. And so, life for these black Oklahomans was segregated. And so, Tulsa, we see this Greenwood area of Tulsa prospering. And so by 1905, the first school was established in a church. 1910, because education was extremely important to the freedmen following the Civil War, and now to these black Americans in the turn of the century. 1910, Dunbar Elementary School that had grades from the 1st to the 8th was established. Then in Dunbar, a high school was established in 1912, and finally in 1913, an independent Booker T. Washington High School was opened. By 1921, Greenwood, the segregated section of Tulsa, had a hospital. It had 2 newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun. It had 13 churches, 3 fraternal lodges, 2 theaters, a public library. Some of the leading citizens of Greenwood area were Dr. Jackson and a businessman, O.W. Gurley. So this was a very prosperous area of Tulsa, and Booker T. Washington, after making a visit to Tulsa, referred to this business district as being the Black Wall Street. He had seen black communities all across the United States, and he noted that this was the most prosperous that he'd ever visited. And so it's also known as Black Wall Street. We'll move to the next panel now. The prosperity of the Greenwood area is now being looked upon with envious eyes by other city officials. And so because of segregation, a black doctor like Dr. Jackson, he would charge his patients a fee. His patients would then pay him the monies for his services. He could then hire a nurse. The nurse could then go to the grocery store. The grocerman could then go to the utilities. The utility people could then go to the cabs. And so what was happening in Greenwood is that $1 is made, and before that dollar left the Greenwood community, it would circulate 13 or 14 different times to different employers and businessmen in the area. Some began to realize that this prosperity could be spread to other areas if Greenwood did not exist. And so plans are being made to do something about this situation. And so we'll move to the next panel. The prosperity in Greenwood, as I said, is causing some city leaders to decide that something needed to be done. The Tulsans' response to this economic empowerment of these black citizens was to put an end to it. And so they felt that these blacks did not know their place and that they needed to be put back in their place. And so, as I said, lynching, night riding, violence, and terror are some of the tools that were used to try to put blacks that were considered to be uppity back in their place. However, by this time in the 1920s, we see militant blacks, ex-soldiers of the First World War. We see the militants, desegregationists of the NAACP, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. These blacks are determined to gain first-class citizenship. And so, Monday morning, May 30th, 1921, because of segregation, blacks were not allowed to use just any restroom facility downtown. And downtown, there were several what they referred to as being boot blacks who operated their small businesses in that area. The only building that they were allowed to use the restroom in was in the Drexel building. And so, that morning, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old shoeshine boy, needed to use the bathroom, and so he enters the Drexel building, goes into the elevator. Now, for some of you who are accustomed to just going into an elevator and pushing the button, this is not the type of elevators that were operating in the 1920s. You had an elevator operator. And so the operator was a young girl, 16 years of age, named Sarah Page. One of the problems that you have with the elevators is that if you don't get the elevator car completely even with the floor, there's a gap that you might trip on. And so one theory is that Dick Rowland was entering the elevator car, caught his foot, and was tripped, and to steady himself, he reaches out and he touches this white girl, Sarah Page. Sarah Page thinks that she's being attacked. She screams out, runs from the elevator car. Dick Rowland, knowing that he is in serious trouble, because, as I said, lynching was not unfamiliar in Oklahoma, he quickly leaves. Everybody knows who he is because he's been working in this area for years. And so the police that afternoon arrest Dick Rowland. Rumors are circulating around Tulsa that a black boy has attacked this this white woman. And so we see the Tulsa Tribune in their afternoon special edition, the Bulldog edition, print this headlines: "To lynch Negro tonight." And so it's clear what the message is to Tulsans, that retribution is going to be extracted for this attack on white womanhood. By 6 o'clock that evening, white men began to gather at the courthouse. And so by 9 o'clock p.m., there were over 400 whites milling about the courthouse. And so Sheriff Willard McCullough tries to disperse the crowd, but he is far outnumbered. And so the word of these whites gathering at the courthouse is now circulating in the segregated Greenwood area. We'll move to the next panel. Now, as I said, by 9 o'clock, there were hundreds of whites armed and ready to take action against Dick Rowland, gathering at the courthouse. The word is circulating in Greenwood that a lynching is about to occur. Black citizens of Greenwood are determined to prevent this from happening. And so a group of about 25 to 30 black men, armed, go to Sheriff McCullough and offer their services to help protect Dick Rowland from the lynch mob. However, Sheriff McCullough repulses them. He tells them it's not necessary. Dick Rowland is going to be safe. So, these black men, after being assured by the sheriff, return to Greenwood. However, the crowd continues to grow until there are about 1,500 to 2,000 armed, angry white men determined to lynch Dick Rowland around the courthouse. So, at 10:30, the blacks return to the courthouse. At this point, one of the mob tries to disarm a black First World War veteran. And so they say, "What are you doing with this gun?" He says that, "I'm going to use it if I have to." And so he tries to disarm him. Shots ring out. And so when the smoke clears, there are over 12 men killed. The blacks, seeing that they are greatly outnumbered, retreat to Greenwood. And so we'll move to the next panel. All right, the confrontation is now beginning between the blacks and white citizens of Tulsa. And so the Tulsa Police Department deputizes hundreds of the mob to go out and disarm these black men who were trying to defend Dick Rowland. The word is soon circulated that 16 stores have been broken in by the white mob and guns and ammunition have been stolen. They turned their attention from lynching Dick Rowland to lynching Greenwood. So, as a result, the first attempt to invade Greenwood is repulsed. And so a battle ensues between blacks and whites at the Frisco Railroad line. And during this first battle, the blacks were able to prevent the invaders of their neighborhood from coming in through a hail of bullets. But blacks are retreating back into Greenwood. The white mob is now reinforcing themselves. And so at daybreak, a signal is given and a mighty rush is pushed into Greenwood by the white mob, killing blacks on sight. And so everybody that they encounter, they kill. They began looting the homes of these prosperous blacks. They began burning to cover the crimes of the riots, the looting and the murdering. And so blacks were now disarmed and taken to McNulty Park and the fairgrounds to be held in detention. This leaves Greenwood defenseless. Now, the most controversial aspect of this conflagration between blacks and whites in Tulsa was the use of airplanes. Airplanes were stolen from Skelly Field, from the airport. They were owned by Skelly Oil Company. And these airplanes were flown over Greenwood and dynamite bombs thrown on the Greenwood residents, giving Tulsa, Oklahoma, the distinction of being the first city in United States history to ever be bombed from an aircraft. The National Guard is informed of the occurrences that have been taking place over the night in Tulsa, and so the National Guard from Oklahoma City is put on a train and brought to Tulsa. By 9:15 a.m., the Oklahoma National Guard finally arrives in Tulsa, and they began to disarm blacks and whites. And so the open fighting is now put under control by the National Guard. 35 blocks of the most prosperous black community in America are now destroyed. They've been burned to the ground. Now, no funeral services are going to be allowed. And so they have to quickly dispose of the bodies because this is in the summer, June 1st and 2nd, and disease is going to be a problem if they don't quickly dispose of these bodies. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission, we set the number at over 300 killed. Now, the controversy today is, where were these black bodies disposed? And so, no funeral services were allowed. Eyewitnesses have told us that mass graves were dug and bodies disposed of. And so the mass graves, they said, were at New Block Park, Oak Lawn Cemetery, and Booker T. Washington Cemetery. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission, we investigated this, and so ground penetrating radar was used to see if there were any mass graves in these areas. The controversy today is the question of mass burial sites in Tulsa. As I said, New Block Park, Oak Lawn Cemetery, Booker T. Washington Cemetery are three very strong possibilities for mass graves. In recent months, we've seen the city of Tulsa allow for excavation in these grave sites and clear indications that there are mass graves have been uncovered. Now, Dick Rowland was spirited out of Tulsa during this riot, and Sarah Page refused to press charges against Dick Rowland. So Dick Rowland was exonerated, and so this concluded the worst race riot in United States history.
That was a wonderful presentation. We encourage you to come, walk through this exhibit. There's so much more than what he could tell you about in this few brief moments. This display will be here for the month of February, There is a great deal to learn, and we encourage you to come maybe more than once. Take a few minutes to look at the panels, to read the information, and of course this video will be up where you can watch it again at future times, and we just are so thankful for his knowledge and expertise, and we thank Mr. White for coming today and encourage you to come and visit this display and see what it has to say. Thank you for joining us today.